Hi friends! My name is Rebecca Curl. I'm a senior psychology student here at UCA, and today I get to talk to you guys about a very important topic that Highland Chapter 7 covers, which is racism in psychology. While we like to think of psychology as a field that is all-inclusive, and while we know that mental health knows no race, gender, or sexual orientation, psychology was not always a very inclusive field of study. Even post-integration in the 1960s in the United States, there were still leaps and bounds that needed to be made for psychology to be considered an inclusive field of study. This is Robert Guthrie, and when he applied to Kentucky Master's Program in 1955, he wrote that he was, quote, the only black face in a sea of white. He actually is the author of a book called Even the Rat Was White, where he discusses the idea that was thrown around in the 50s that African American people were less intelligent. While this book discussed his personal experiences at an all-white school in Kentucky in the 50s, it also opened the conversation up for a lot of the attitudes and stigmas around African American students across all universities. So I want to give you guys two definitions here, one for cognitive bias and implicit bias. So cognitive bias is generally how we use clinical data. Implicit bias is essentially how we use that data through a lens of things such as race, gender, age, sex, or even socioeconomic status. These are two very important terms to think about when we get into the race intelligence controversy. So when researchers were studying data of IQ tests between African Americans and European Americans, they noticed a difference. African Americans had a lower mean IQ score than European Americans. Many people thought that this difference was genetic, however, other people argued differently. That there were two environmental factors that could be causing African Americans to score lower on IQ tests that had nothing to do with genes. One reason was that IQ tests tended to favor the dominant culture or the white culture, meaning the cultural features that were existing in white culture and not in African American culture. The second was that IQ was affected by the environment. It's factual that these African American environments in the 50s and 60s when they were studying these IQ tests were not beneficial for development. While we now know that there is no genetic difference in the brain makeups of different races, there is still major work to do in the field of psychology to become inclusive. Things such as cognitive and implicit bias specifically continue to affect the way that psychologists treat, diagnose, and medicate minority groups. It is becoming increasingly important for psychologists to be culturally competent. Through open attitude, self-awareness, awareness of others, cultural knowledge, and cultural skills, psychologists can help to combat our own implicit bias and help bridge the gap between races when it comes to the study, research, treatment, and diagnosis of mental health.